The morning fog lay thick over Ashwood Cemetery, a pale shroud that softened every shape into shadow. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches stretching upward, as if trying to pierce the heavy gray sky. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and the fading sweetness of wilted flowers. Richard Hale stood motionless among the gravestones, his black overcoat tailored to perfection, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the dew-soaked ground. To an outsider, he might have looked like a man of composure, elegance, and unshakable discipline. But beneath that flawless exterior lay a storm of silence that had haunted him for nearly a decade. He stared at the marble headstone before him. The name carved into the stone still had the power to undo him. Eleanor Hale, beloved wife, 1976 to 2013. 10 years. A decade since he had held her hand for the last time. 10 years of building his empire higher and wider as if steel and glass could fill the void. She left behind. I made another deal this week. Eleanor, he whispered, his voice rasping against the cold morning air. The towers in Dubai are complete. They're already calling in an icon of the skyline. His throat tightened. I suppose you'd tell me it looks like a stack of shoeboxes, wouldn't you? A dry laugh escaped him, broken and bitter. He pressed a hand against the stone, the chill seeping into his palm. The empire is larger than ever. Wealth, power, influence. But none of it matters here. Not really. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of rain. Richard adjusted his cufflinks out of habit, glancing at his watch. Always on time, always in control. In 20 minutes, his driver would pull the Bentley to the front gates. By 9, he would sit across from men who controlled nations with their money. His entire life had become a sequence of precise appointments, yet none could erase this ritual. His solitary visits to Eleanor's grave. He straightened, preparing to turn away, when a sound reached him through the mist. It was faint, almost, swallowed by the stillness, a child's sob, carried on the wind. Richard froze, his heart hammering once before reason tried to smother it. He told himself it was nothing, an echo, perhaps the cry of a bird. But then it came again, thin and unmistakable, the quiet grief of a little one. His eyes scanned the rows of gravestones until they found her, several yards away. A small figure knelt in the grass before a simple granite marker. She wore a red coat that barely reached her knees. It seemed fraying, the fabric thin against the October chill. Her shoes were scuffed, one lace trailing untied into the mud. In her small hand she clutched a wrinkled drawing, the paper limp from her grip. Richard's breath caught as he watched her arrange a cluster of wildflowers at the grave, yellow and white, their stems uneven and bent. She smoothed the petals carefully, her tiny fingers trembling. Then she leaned closer to the headstone and spoke, her voice shaking with tears. "Mommy, I tried to be brave." The words pierced Richard with a force he did not expect. They echoed in the hollow chamber of his own heart, a reflection of all he had never dared to say aloud. He gripped the handle of his umbrella harder, unsure why he couldn't look away. The fog curled around the girl as if sheltering her in her sorrow. And for the first time in years, Richard felt something stir inside him, something dangerously close to empathy. Who was this child? Alone in the graveyard on a school morning? And why did her broken voice feel like it belonged to his own grief? The fog had not yet lifted when Richard Hale slid into the back of his Bentley. But his thoughts were not on the investors awaiting him or the speech carefully crafted by his team. They were on the girl in the red coat. He tried to steady his breathing, to silence the echo of her voice. "Mommy, I tried to be brave." It rattled inside him like a secret he had never dared to speak, a truth that belonged as much to him as it did to her. James, his driver of 15 years, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Sir, to the tower." Richard opened his mouth to answer, but faltered. For a man who had built his life on precision, on never wavering, the hesitation was almost unthinkable. He nodded stiffly, but his mind was not on glass towers or stock prices. As the car rolled forward, he craned his neck just once, just long enough to glimpse the silhouette of that small figure through the mist. Still kneeling by the granite headstone, the sight unsettled him more than he cared to admit. By the time he reached the gleaming lobby of Hale International, his body was there, but his soul was elsewhere. Assistants rushed to meet him, folders in hand, every second of his day mapped and measured. He went through the motions, handshakes, clipped greetings, the perfunctory nods of a man used to control, but he was distracted, his mind snagged on an image of damp shoes, wildflowers, and trembling hands. In the boardroom, The screens lit up with numbers, charts, projections. Marcus, his closest advisor, launched into the presentation. The Tokyo deal is at a tipping point. Richard, the Japanese delegation is waiting for your assurance that we're still committed. Richard should have leaned in, should have cut through hesitation with his trademark decisiveness. Instead, he heard himself ask a question that froze the room. Marcus, do you have children? The question dropped like a stone into water. Silence rippled outward. Marcus blinked, confused. Yes, sir, two. Why? Richard only nodded, his gaze drifting toward the glass wall that looked down on the city. The skyline sparkled with everything he had built, but for the first time, it felt hollow. The meeting stumbled forward, but his mind refused to follow. By noon, he dismissed them, claiming exhaustion. He retreated to his office, where sunlight filtered cold and thin through the blinds. He opened the top drawer of his desk, a place he rarely touched, and pulled out a photograph. Elena, his wife, laughing at a picnic, hair tangled by the wind. She had wanted children. He had said there was no time. Work came first. Empire came first. And now she was gone. And he was left with walls of steel and glass that meant nothing. At all. The next morning, the fog returned, and so did Richard. He told himself it was habit, that he only wished to leave fresh flowers for Elena. But his eyes sought another headstone before his feet carried him there. She was there again, the little girl. This time she held a small lunchbox, the kind sold at discount stores. She unpacked it carefully at the grave, revealing a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and an apple. She placed the food on the stone as though setting the table. I packed one. For you too, Mommy, she whispered, her voice steadier than the day before. Grandma says I should eat more, but I want you to have some first. Richard's chest tightened. He had known hunger in his youth before money insulated him from every discomfort. But to see a child so small sharing her lunch with a memory, there was a purity to it that broke him. And then he noticed something. She was alone again, no guardian, no adult. Only a fragile figure in a red coat in a place where children did not belong unattended. Richard stepped forward, his polished shoes crunching softly on the gravel path. The girl stiffened, turning sharply. For a moment, fear flashed in her amber eyes, fear, then defiance. She did not shrink back. You came back, she said, as though surprised, but not frightened. He cleared his throat, unused to speaking without scripts or rehearsals. So did you? Shouldn't you be at school? Her gaze dropped to the apple on the stone. I had to bring her lunch first. She doesn't like to eat alone. The simple words gutted him. He stood there in silence, rain beginning to fall again, soaking through his coat. A man with empires at his command in. He could not find a single word that fit the moment. But a thought gnawed at him now, sharp and relentless. Why was this child always alone at her mother's grave? And where was the person who should have been protecting her? The rain had become a curtain, draping the graveyard in silver threads. But Richard Hale did not retreat. He was not a man who lingered without purpose. Yet something about the girl rooted him to the spot. She finished her whispered conversation with a headstone, brushed her damp braid from her face, and carefully tucked the drawing back into her lunchbox. When she finally stood, her coat clung to her small frame, soaked through. She turned toward the path, but Richard noticed her glance over her shoulder once, twice, as if checking that her mother's grave would remain safe in her absence. He followed at a distance, his black umbrella shielding him while the child trudged without one. His shoes clicked softly on the gravel, her squished in the mud. She walked with purpose, not wandering, not lost. She seemed to know exactly where she was going. The cemetery gates creaked when she pushed them open, and beyond the iron bars, the city stirred with the bustle of morning cars honking, buses groaning, shopkeepers rolling up metal shutters. It was a world Richard knew intimately, a world he had conquered with ruthless precision. Yet here, trailing a girl no taller than his desk chair, that world felt strange, as though he were seeing it for the first time. She darted down side streets, keeping her head low, avoiding adults who might ask questions. Richard's driver would have scolded him for this reckless pursuit, but he ignored the risk of being recognized. The great Richard Hale, a titan of industry, followed a child through alleys that smelled of rain and rust. Finally, she slipped into a worn-out apartment block. The paint peeled from the bricks. Windows were patched with cardboard, and the metal staircase trembled under her small steps. Richard paused at the base of the building, his hand tightening on the umbrella. His penthouse, perched above the skyline, glittered with marble floors and glass walls. This building sagged with exhaustion, as though one more storm might knock it down. For a moment, Richard considered turning back. He could excuse this diversion as curiosity, dismiss it as nothing more than misplaced sympathy. But the words returned, "Mommy, I tried to be brave." His chest tightened. He could not walk away. He climbed the stairs after her, careful not to let his weight creak the metal too loudly. Through the thin walls, he heard coughing deep, labored, the kind that rattled from lungs scarred by time and sickness. The girl's small voice followed, "Grandma, I brought your tea, and I told Mommy about school. She said she's proud of me. I think she really is." Richard froze, his breath caught in his throat. The voices from inside that dim apartment pulled at him like invisible hands. He moved closer to the door, just enough to hear more clearly. A frail woman answered between coughs. "You shouldn't have gone alone, Leela. You promised me you wouldn't." The girl Leela spoke softly, guilty yet firm. "I had to. She gets lonely if I don't go." Richard's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Leela, the name carved itself into his mind. He did not know why, but it felt as though he had heard it before, long ago. Suddenly, the door swung inward. Leela stood there, startled, her amber eyes widening when she saw him. The frail woman appeared behind her, gray hair pulled into a bun, her face pale and drawn with illness. When her gaze shifted to Richard, she gasped, gripping the doorframe. "For support, Mr. Hale." Her voice cracked in disbelief. Richard's blood ran cold. He had not spoken his name. He had not introduced himself. Yet this woman knew exactly who he was. The little girl blinked between them, confusion written on her damp face. "Grandma, you know him." The woman nodded slowly, still staring at Richard, as if she had seen a ghost. "Yes, Leela, I know him. I was your mother's nurse, and his wife's too." The world tilted under Richard's feet. Elena, his Elena Dot, and the girl's mother. Threads of memory pulled tight, threatening to unravel everything Richard thought he knew. He had come here chasing a child. He had found a connection he could not yet explain, one that tied his late wife, a stranger's daughter, and his own abandoned promises into a knot he wasn't sure he wanted to untangle. But one thing was certain, this was no coincidence. Richard Hale stood at the threshold of the apartment, rainwater dripping from the edge of his umbrella, his tailored suit still damp from the cemetery mist. The air inside carried the smell of chamomile tea and something else, medicine, sharp and bitter. The frail woman's hand trembled against the doorframe, but her gaze never wavered. She was staring at him not as one stares at a stranger, but as someone remembering a face from another life. "Come in," she whispered at last, her voice raspy but insistent. "Leela, go change out of those wet clothes." The little girl obeyed, reluctantly, her small feet pattering down the hall, the lunchbox still clutched against her chest. Richard hesitated. He was a man who had sat across from prime ministers, silenced hostile boardrooms with a single word, and dictated the direction of entire markets, but here, in front of this weary woman and her shadowed eyes, he felt like an intruder. Still, he stepped inside. The apartment was small, every corner speaking of struggle yet touched with care. The furniture was worn, but covered with handmade quilts. Pictures lined the walls, not of wealth or travel, but of family moments, a child, blowing bubbles, a young woman with laughing eyes holding a newborn, an older woman's hand resting protectively on their shoulders. Richard's gaze lingered on one photo in particular, his chest tightening as recognition flared. Elena, his wife. She was smiling faintly in the corner of the photograph, thinner than he remembered, her hair tied back beneath a scarf she had worn in her last months. Beside her sat a young woman, visibly pregnant, with the same amber eyes as Leela. The caption scrawled in blue ink beneath the frame read, "Anna, 1 week before due date, with Nurse Margaret and kind visitor Elena." Richard's hand trembled as he lifted the frame. The frail woman Margaret sank into a chair, watching him carefully. "You remember her," she said. It wasn't a question. "My wife," his voice cracked. She was here, with her." He pointed to Anna in the photograph. Margaret's face softened with sorrow. Elena used to talk to Anna often. She'd come to the ward not just as a patient, but as a friend. She recognized the loneliness in Anna, the fear of raising a child without support. They became close in those last weeks. She asked me to look after both of them if she couldn't. Margaret's. Words trailed off into a cough. Richard set the photograph down with a shaking hand. His world was shifting beneath him, the past colliding with the present. Elena hadn't just been thinking of herself. In her dying days, she had been thinking of a child that was not even born yet. Lila. He ran a hand over his face, trying to steady the storm inside him. Why didn't anyone tell me? Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. You weren't listening back then, Mr. Hale. Elena begged you to slow down, to look beyond the glass towers. But you buried yourself in work. Anna didn't want to trouble you. She thought you wouldn't care. The words hit harder than any boardroom ambush. Richard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Just then, Lila returned, her braid dripping onto a fresh sweater disguised as small. She climbed onto the worn sofa and looked at Richard with those amber eyes. That now felt like an inheritance, a bridge from Elena to this child. Mr. Hale, she said, her voice steady in a way that didn't fit her age. Why were you at the cemetery again? Did you know my mommy too? The room still. Richard's throat constricted. Margaret's eyes urged caution, but the truth pressed against his chest like a locked door straining against its hinges. I knew. Someone who loved your mommy very much, Richard managed finally. And I think she wanted me to find you. Suspense curled thick in the silence that followed. Leela studied him, her small hand tightening around the drawing she had carried earlier. Then, with a simplicity only a child could summon, she asked the question that would unravel the rest. Are you supposed to take care of us now? Richard felt his breath leave him as though she had spoken Elena's dying wish aloud. His empire, his schedule, his billions, they all meant nothing against that single, devastating question, and deep down, he knew the answer. The rain had stopped by the time Richard Hale returned to his penthouse that night, but the storm within him refused to quiet. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city sprawled beneath him like a glittering empire he had carved. With ruthless precision, skyscrapers bore his name, markets bent to his will. And yet, all he could see was a little girl's face, amber eyes staring up at him with that piercing question. Are you supposed to take care of us now? He poured himself a glass of scotch, the burn in his throat doing little too steady, the quake in his chest. His penthouse was immaculate, a museum of wealth and discipline. No toys scattered across the floor, no messy drawings taped to the refrigerator, no laughter echoing through the rooms. The silence pressed down on him like a weight. Sleep was impossible. Restlessness drove him to the country estate he had abandoned years ago after Elena's death. The mansion loomed in darkness, vines crawling up its stone walls like the fingers of time reclaiming what he had left behind. Dust coated every surface. Furniture sat draped in white sheets like shrouds over ghosts. The house smelled of memory, of life interrupted. Richard moved through the rooms like a man retracing his own mistakes until he reached Elena's study. It had always been her sanctuary. He pushed the door open, and the hinges groaned in protest. Everything was just as she had left it. Shelves lined with books, a desk cluttered with notebooks, her fountain pen resting at an exact angle. He touched the pen with trembling fingers before pulling open the drawer. There was a small, leather-bound journal. His breath hitched as he lifted it out. The cover was worn smooth by her hands, the pages edged with the faint yellow of time. He carried it to the window and opened it carefully, almost reverently, as if afraid it might disintegrate under his touch. The entries began simple. Her days in the hospital, moments of pain eased by Margaret's kindness, fleeting joys of sunlight and music. But then his eyes caught a name that made his chest seize. Anna came today. She's afraid. The baby's coming soon, and she doesn't know how she'll manage. I promised her that Richard would look out for the child if I couldn't. He doesn't know yet, but one day he'll understand. He'll need this more than the child will. Richard's hand shook as he turned the page. I told Margaret, too. If anything happens, they must remind Richard. He thinks he's building towers, but he's really building walls. One day, I pray he'll break them down for the child, for himself. His knees weakened, and he sank into Elena's chair. The leather creaked under his weight, groaning as though he carried the sorrow of 10 years. His wife had seen everything: his obsession with empire, his blindness to what truly mattered, and she had made a plan. She had trusted him with a promise he never even knew he'd made. The journal fell into his lap as a sound escaped his throat, something between a gasp and a sob. The woman he had loved more than life had tied him to the very child who now sat in a cramped apartment with patched sweaters and fading hope. Leela. He closed his eyes, but her voice chased him in the darkness. "Are you supposed to take care of us now?" The answer was no longer a question, it was destiny. The next morning, Richard did something his board would later describe as madness. He summoned his legal team, his architects, his philanthropic advisors, and locked them in a room for 12 hours. He laid Elena's journal on the table, his finger pressed to the page where her dream had been written. "We're building this," he said. "The Sarah Hale Foundation for Children, a community center, art rooms, therapy programs, gardens, scholarships. I don't care what it costs. Find the land near Pinewood Gardens. Make it happen." One of the lawyers frowned nervously. "Sir, the Tokyo investors," Richard's voice cut like steel. "Forget Tokyo. Forget the board. This is the only deal that matters." Word spread quickly. Henderson, his rival executive, smelled blood in the water. By nightfall, whispers filled the corridors of Hale International, the king of precision. The man who had once fired a senior partner for missing a meeting by 3 minutes was unraveling. He was throwing billions into a project with no profit, no market return, no corporate strategy. But Richard did not care. That evening, as the city lights flickered alive, he returned to Pinewood Gardens. He carried the journal with him like scripture. Margaret opened the door cautiously, her cough worse than the day before. Layla ran to greet him, paint on her fingers, eyes wide with excitement. "You came back," she said, almost accusingly, as if daring him to prove he wasn't like all the others who promised and disappeared. "I told you I would," Richard said, his voice steadier than he felt. He knelt to her level, holding out the journal. "This belonged to someone very important, inside of her dreams, and I think you're part of them." Leela tilted her head, confusion shadowing her face. Margaret's eyes, however, widened with recognition. She reached out, touching the journal with trembling hands. "Elena's," she whispered. Richard nodded. "She wanted this child cared for. She wanted me to build something that mattered. I failed her for 10 years. I won't fail again." For the first time in his adult life, Richard Hale felt a different kind of power, not the power of wealth or fear, but the power of purpose. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was that his decision would not only set him against his own board of directors, but also unearth secrets buried even deeper than Elena's journal. Secrets that would threaten the fragile safety of the child he now felt bound to protect. And when the storm came, Richard would have to decide, was he willing to lose everything he had built to keep a promise to the woman he had loved, and to the little girl who carried her eyes? The days that followed Richard Hale's decision were unlike anything he had lived in the past 10 years. The man, once obsessed with punctuality, projections, and power, found himself poring over blueprints instead of balance sheets, asking about playground materials instead of profit margins, and spending evenings in a cramped apartment with a little girl who thought butterflies were the most important symbol in the world. But change never comes without consequence. At Hale International, the walls of the glass tower began to hum with unease. Board members whispered in private meetings. Stock analysts questioned his focus. And Henderson the vulture, who had long been waiting for Richard to slip, circulated memos that painted him as unstable, distracted, dangerous to shareholder interests. The crisis struck one cold Tuesday morning. Richard had been at the community center site, wearing a hard hat and rolling up his sleeves as Leela cheerfully smeared blue paint across a wall he had promised would one day be filled with children's drawings. Margaret sat nearby on a folding chair, her cough a little worse, but her eyes alive with something Richard hadn't seen in years. Hope. That was when Marcus, his longtime advisor, arrived with a face pale as paper. "Richard," he said, tugging him aside, "there's an emergency board session. Henderson's called for a vote of no confidence. They want to strip you of your authority." Richard's jaw tightened. He had expected pushback, but this was war. "Tell them I'll be there tomorrow," he said calmly. Marcus looked at him as though he had gone mad. "Tomorrow? Richard, you're painting walls with a child while Henderson is gathering signatures to push you out of your own empire." Richard glanced at Leela. She had turned the blue smears into the wings of a butterfly, her tongue poking from the corner of her mouth in concentration. Her innocence was fragile, but her determination was fierce. "She asked me to help her finish the mural today," Richard said. His voice was softer than usual, but carried a weight Marcus had never heard before. "I'm not breaking that promise." The next morning, Richard walked into the boardroom not as the invincible titan they were used to, but as a man carrying something greater than quarterly projections. He set Elena's journal on the polished mahogany table and let silence stretch, until even Henderson shifted uneasily in his seat. "You all think I've lost focus," Richard said, his voice steady. "You're right. For 10 years, my focus was steel, glass, and numbers, and in that focus, I forgot the promises that truly matter." He opened the journal, turning it so they could all see Elena's handwriting. "This is my wife's dream, a foundation that will outlast towers, outlast profit. I intend to build it. And if any of you believe I'm abandoning the company, then you've forgotten why we exist at all." The room erupted in arguments, Henderson's voice the loudest. He painted Richard as reckless, claiming sentimental weakness would bankrupt them all. But Marcus, to everyone's surprise, stood. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, his tone sharp, "when Richard Hale bet everything on glass towers 15 years ago, you all called him insane. Those towers now define skylines around the world. If he says this is the future, I trust him." The vote was postponed. Henderson's face was stone, but Richard knew he had only delayed the inevitable. That night, Richard returned to Pinewood Gardens. He was weary, but strangely at peace. Lila met him at the door, beaming, holding up a crayon drawing. "It's U.S., she announced. "You, me, and Grandma, standing in front of the center when it opens." Richard knelt to take it, his throat tightening. The crude sketch felt more valuable than any award he had ever received, but peace rarely lingers. Later, when Margaret had gone to bed and Leela had curled up with her sketchbook, Richard's phone buzzed with an anonymous message. "You should stop digging into promises that aren't yours. Anna's death wasn't an accident. And if you don't walk away, the child won't be safe either." The glass slipped from his hand, shattering across the floor. Richard froze, every muscle locking with dread. The words glared up at him from the screen like a threat written in fire. He looked toward Lila's sleeping form, the rise and fall of her small chest, the innocence he had sworn to protect. In that moment, Richard understood. Henderson was not the real enemy. Somewhere in the shadows, forces tied to Anna's death still lurked. And now, by stepping into Lila's life, Richard had painted a target not only on himself but on her. For the first time in years, fear not for money, not for empire, but for a child coursed through his veins. And Richard Hale, who had once ruled boardrooms with logic alone, made a silent vow in the darkness: if they come for her, they will go through me first. Night weighed heavy over the city, its skyline a jagged crown of light. Richard Hale stood alone on the balcony of his penthouse, the anonymous message still burning on his phone screen. Anna's death wasn't an accident, and if you don't walk away, the child won't be safe either. The words haunted him, cutting deeper than any corporate threat ever had. He had fought rivals, hostile takeovers, governments even, but this was different. This was not about money. This was about a little girl who trusted him enough to draw him into her family with crayons and shaky handwriting. For the first time in his adult life, Richard wasn't strategizing about quarterly margins. He was planning how to protect someone else's heartbeat. The following day, Marcus arrived in his office with grim news. Henderson had accelerated his campaign. An emergency vote was scheduled within 48 hours. If Richard didn't show results, they would seize control of Hale International. But Richard's attention was split. He slid the phone across the desk to Marcus, showing him the threatening message. Marcus read it, his expression darkening. "This isn't corporate politics. This is personal, more than personal," Richard said quietly. "Anna's death wasn't random. Someone wanted her gone, and now they want to finish what they started." Marcus leaned in. "Do you believe the board's involved?" "No," Richard said, shaking his head. "Henderson's a snake, but he's predictable. This smells of something else. The people Anna was connected to before she died. Whatever debts or enemies she left behind." Marcus frowned. "Then we're dealing with criminals, not businessmen." Richard's gaze hardened. "Then we fight like it." That night, he returned to Pinewood Gardens with security detail discreetly posted at the corners of the block. Margaret, pale but resolute, listened to his explanation with eyes that glistened. "I always suspected," she whispered. "The police said accident, but the brake lines, they didn't want to say too much. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I just raised Leela quietly, we'd be safe." Richard crouched beside Leela, who sat cross-legged on the floor with her markers. She looked up at him, sensing the tension even though no one had told her. "Are you scared, Mr. Hale?" She asked softly. Richard paused, then answered truthfully, yes, Leela. But sometimes being scared means you have something worth protecting. She studied his face with those amber eyes, Elena's eyes, and nodded. Then I'm scared too. But we can be brave together. The storm broke 3 nights later. Richard had insisted they stay at the estate outside the city, believing its gates and distance would provide safety. The house, once abandoned, now echoed with hurried preparations, locks reinforced, security cameras reactivated, staff vetted. Margaret dozed upstairs, exhausted from her medicine. Leela fell asleep in one of Elena's old rooms, surrounded by the warmth of quilts and the soft glow of a nightlight Richard had found in storage. But at 2:17 a.m., the dogs began to bark. Richard was already awake, pacing with Elena's journal clutched in his hand. He rushed to the window and caught sight of shadows moving near the tree line. Too many to organize. His phone buzzed. A message from security. Intrusion detected. Armed. Moving fast. For a split second, fear froze him. Then instinct shattered it. He strode down the hall, into Lila's room. She blinked awake as he scooped her into his arms. What's happening? She whispered, her voice trembling. Nothing you need to fear, Richard said firmly, though his heart pounded. I've got you. I won't let anything happen to you. The estate erupted. Shouts outside. Lights flaring. The crackle of radios. Men tried to breach the gates, but Richard's guards were ready. Shots rang out in the distance. Muffled, but terrifying in the silence of the house, Margaret stumbled into the hallway, coughing, her eyes wide with panic. Go to the cellar, Richard commanded. Now, they descended into the stone-walled basement, the air damp and cold. Richard locked the heavy door behind them, heart hammering as footsteps thundered across the estate above. For long minutes, the world seemed to narrow to Lila's small hand clutching his. Her pulse rapid against his skin. Then silence. At last, Marcus himself appeared at the cellar door, his voice urgent. It's over. They're retreating. Police are en route. Where Richard stepped back into the night air, the estate was scarred, broken gates, scorch marks from flash grenades. But Lila was safe, and in that moment, standing amid chaos, he realized he no longer cared if Hale International burned. His empire was nothing compared to this child's safety. The next morning, Richard walked into the boardroom not as a CEO, but as a man reborn. He slammed Elena's journal onto the table, the leather scarred from years of neglect. My wife saw the future more clearly than any of you, he told them, and last night, that future was almost stolen. Not by investors, not by rivals, but by the kind of rot we've allowed to fester by chasing profit at all costs. From this day forward, Hale International funds the Sarah Hale Foundation fully. If you want a different leader, take your vote now. Silence gripped the room. Even Henderson, red-faced and trembling, couldn't muster the courage. The events at the estate had leaked already. The press was calling Richard not just a tycoon, but a protector, a man who risked his life for a child who wasn't even his by blood. Public opinion was surging, unstoppable. The board folded. Henderson resigned within the week. Weeks later, under a sky washed clean by spring rain, the community center opened its doors. Layla stood beside Richard at the ribbon, scissors trembling. In her hands, Margaret, frail but smiling, watched from her chair. You ready? Richard asked softly. Layla looked up at him, amber eyes bright. You promised you'd be here, she said. I keep my promises now, Richard whispered. She cut the ribbon. The crowd erupted in applause, and Richard felt something crack wide, open inside him. Later, in the garden behind the center, Leela tugged his sleeve. Mr. Hale. Yes. Leila. She hesitated, then spoke with the blunt honesty only a child could wield. I don't think you're Mr. Hale anymore. You're Dad. That's what Mommy would have wanted. Richard's throat closed. He knelt, tears he hadn't allowed himself in years finally breaking free. He wrapped his arms around her small frame, holding her as tightly as he dared. Yes, he whispered into her hair, Dad will do just fine. And as the butterflies rose from the garden bed's bright wings, scattering into the spring air, Richard Hale knew he had made the only choice that had ever truly mattered.